When the war in Europe ended, the Allies faced an unprecedented task, publicly judging the main leaders of a defeated state for crimes committed over years, on multiple fronts, and against entire populations. From that decision, the Nuremberg International Military Tribunal was born. But before the defendants sat before the judges, someone had to answer a preliminary question. Were they mentally fit to stand trial? In that context, the name of Douglas Kelly emerged. He was a relatively young officer, trained in psychiatry and with experience in the European theater of operations. The US Army assigned him a dual role, to assess the mental health of the detainees and to help keep them stable until the end of the proceedings. There was a very clear pragmatic component. A psychotic outbreak, a nervous breakdown, or a wave of suicides could jeopardize the legitimacy of the trials. The Nuremberg prison, run by Colonel Burton Andrus, became Kelly's working laboratory. In the same corridor, in numbered cells, were concentrated some of the most feared figures of the 20th century. Hermann Göring, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Wilhelm Keitel, Alfred Rosenberg, among others. Each of them carried a personal history, a military or political rank, and a set of accusations ranging from conspiracy to genocide. The psychiatrist had to see one by one all these men. The official mission was perfectly defined in legal terms. Kelly had to determine whether the defendants understood the nature of the charges, whether they could cooperate with their lawyers, and whether they distinguished in basic terms right from wrong. If a prisoner presented severe psychotic symptoms, uncontrollable delusions, or extreme cognitive deterioration, their capacity to stand trial was in question. The tribunal needed clear, direct, unambiguous reports. But from the beginning, Kelly felt that this was not the whole story. He was not facing patients voluntarily admitted to a hospital, but individuals directly responsible for a machinery of mass destruction. The professional question, is he competent to stand trial, merged in his mind with another much broader one. What makes a person like this order and justify crimes of such magnitude? The medical assignment almost inevitably turned into a unique psychological experiment. The prison environment reinforced that feeling. The cells were small, constantly lit, and monitored day and night. Guards had to record any strange gesture, any comment that hinted at suicidal intent. It was not a theoretical concern. Some Nazi detainees had already taken their own lives before the trials, and the Allies wanted to prevent that from happening again. Every jar, every rope, every potentially dangerous object was controlled. Amid that rigid environment, Kelly moved with relative freedom. He had daily access to the cells, could converse with the prisoners, observe them in moments of calm and tension, and see how they reacted to news from the outside or tribunal decisions. Very soon he realized that it was not enough to administer a few tests and sign a report. If he wanted to understand what kind of men he had in front of him, he needed time, repetition, and a contrast between what they said and how they said it. At first, Kelly himself expected to find a clear pattern of mental illness. Not necessarily in all of them, but in the ringleaders. Delusions of grandeur, approaching psychosis, disconnection from reality, some kind of disorder that would explain what they had done. It seemed almost impossible to him that such extreme decisions could come from ordinary minds. That initial prejudice, shared by much of the public, gave his mission an almost hopeful tint. If the Nazis turned out to be mad, perhaps the world could reassure itself by thinking that what happened was a one-time anomaly. But as the days went by, his focus shifted from the search for striking symptoms towards something more subtle: the structure of personality, the way of reasoning, the moral justifications the prisoners used to explain their role in the regime. The work ceased to be a simple medical filter and became a kind of psychological interrogation running parallel to the judicial process, in which Kelly himself was judge, observer, and, to some extent, the sole audience. In that setting, Hermann Göring immediately began to stand out, not only because of his rank, but because of the way he took control of any space he entered. The psychiatrist quickly understood that his mission would not be a routine clinical procedure. Evaluating Göring's mind would become the centerpiece of his work in Nuremberg and the key to answering the question that had haunted him since his arrival. If this man was not insane, what exactly was he? The prisoner who commanded the cell. First portrait of Hermann Göring. When Douglas Kelly began his rounds down the Nuremberg cell corridor, He quickly identified who was the invisible axis of that small universe. There was no need to read the file. Just observing for a few minutes was enough to understand that even defeated without a uniform and behind bars, Hermann Göring still behaved like a man accustomed to giving orders. The other defendants glanced toward his door, awaited his comments, and measured their words according to the reaction of the former Reich Marshal. At first sight, Göring's figure drew attention purely for his physical presence. He had noticeably lost weight since his capture, following a controlled process to detox from the morphine to which he had been addicted for years. Yet he still retained an imposing build, an upright posture, and a way of occupying space that commanded respect even within the confines of a cell. When he sat in front of Kelly, he did not behave like an insecure patient, but like a man accustomed to managing matters of state. From the first interviews, the psychiatrist noticed that Göring had a special talent for taking over a situation. He would stand when an officer entered, greet with calculated courtesy, make a joke or witty comment to ease the atmosphere, and within seconds it seemed as if he were receiving the visitors, not the other way around. In conversations with Kelly, he answered questions with ease, often expanding on them and redirecting the focus to topics that favored him. He showed no apparent anxiety, no explicit fear, no signs of mental confusion. In the exercise yard during controlled walks, his leadership was even more evident. The other prisoners naturally tended to group around him. Some sought his approval, others his symbolic protection or at least his company. Göring distributed sarcastic remarks, political observations and recollections from his time in power with a mix of nostalgia and arrogance. The prison's informal hierarchy reproduced on a smaller scale the power structure of the former regime, and he was at the top. Kelly observed this behavior with clinical curiosity. For a psychiatrist accustomed to seeing patients in hospital settings where authority belongs to the doctor, it was disconcerting to deal with someone who seemed to claim control of the scene even as a prisoner. Instead of a man broken by defeat, he found an individual who continued to use his charisma as a tool of dominance. That ability to organize the social environment around him was, for Kelly, one of the keys to the character. In one-on-one interviews, Göring displayed all his skill in presenting himself as a historical figure. He enjoyed recounting episodes from his past, his time as a flying ace in World War I, his role in the early years of the Nazi Party, his rapid rise in the hierarchy of the Third Reich. He narrated political battles, internal intrigues, high-level decisions, always with himself at the center of the stage. Kelly noted that even when he admitted mistakes, he did so in a way that reinforced his image as a strong, indispensable, almost tragic man. What drew attention was not just the content of his words, but the tone. Göring spoke clearly, with well-constructed sentences using humor when it suited him and dramatics when he wanted to emphasize a point. He could shift from arrogance to victimhood in a matter of seconds if he sensed it would generate some empathy in his interlocutor. He never seemed to lose sight of the effect his words had. It was not the speech of a delusional person. It was the calculated performance of someone who knew he still had an audience. Kelly also noticed the way Göring managed information within the prison. The former Nazi leader presented himself to the other detainees as an expert on the Allied judicial system, someone who knew how the Americans worked and what they could expect from the tribunal. Sometimes he downplayed the severity of the situation, other times he acted defiantly, insisting that history would judge them differently. That combination of confidence and defiance reinforced his informal leadership. In private, however, another facet emerged. In some sessions, when he felt more relaxed, Göring revealed moments of calculated introspection. He could acknowledge that the war was lost, that the Reich had collapsed, and that, most likely, he would not leave Nuremberg alive. Yet even then, his main concern seemed to be how he would be remembered. He returned again and again to the idea of posterity, his place in history books, the image that would remain of him. The fear was less about death than about irrelevance. For Kelly, this detail was crucial. A man obsessed with his legacy is constantly performing, even in the privacy of a cell. Every gesture, every response, every potential confidence becomes a piece of the image he wants to construct. The psychiatrist realized that, when sitting in front of Göring, he was not just speaking to a defendant, he was confronting an actor who knew he was being observed and who used the situation to continue exercising control. The relationship between them grew increasingly nuanced. Göring seemed to enjoy the intellectual game of the interviews. Sometimes he tried to reverse the roles, asking Kelly questions about US politics, the morality of Allied bombings, or the future of Germany. All of this had a dual purpose: to humanize himself before the doctor and, at the same time, test him, gauge his reactions, and explore to what extent he could influence him. Kelly, for his part, tried to maintain professional distance, but he could not deny that the subject was fascinating. The contrast between the crime file and the actual man before him was stark. He did not see a broken, incoherent, or delusional individual, but someone who maintained remarkable control over himself and others, even in the worst circumstances of his life. That dissonance between the monstrosity of the acts and the apparent normality of behavior gradually sank in with the psychiatrist, who began to suspect that his mission in Nuremberg would lead him to a conclusion no one wanted to hear. In the laboratory of the mind, psychological tests and results. For Douglas Kelly, the impressions formed in the cell corridor were not enough. The psychiatrist wanted more than intuitions about the character of Göring and the other inmates. He needed data. He came from an academic environment strongly influenced by the rise of psychological testing, had worked at the Rorschach Institute, and was imbued with the idea that the mind could be described through systematic procedures. Nuremberg offered him in this sense a unique and terrifying laboratory. 22 leaders of a criminal regime concentrated in one place, willing or not to be examined. The battery Kelly prepared combined several levels. First, a complete medical examination, general physical condition, history of illnesses, possible sequelae from war injuries and substance use. He knew that any organic alteration could influence behavior or mimic a mental disorder. Next came prolonged clinical interviews in which he not only asked direct questions but observed the way of speaking, coherence of discourse, lapses and silences. And finally, the most innovative instruments, intelligence tests and projective tests, especially the Rorschach plates, those seemingly symmetrical ink blots that invited interpretation. With Hermann Göring, he applied the full package. He began with the intelligence tests. The former Reich Marshal was delighted to participate. For a man obsessed with hierarchy, any ranking was an opportunity to stand out. Facing vocabulary, logical reasoning, and situational comprehension problems, he responded quickly, often with a small smile of self-satisfaction, as if he found the exercise amusing. The result was striking. Kelly recorded an IQ of 138, one of the highest among the defendants. That figure, far from surprising Göring, seemed to confirm the grandiose image he had of himself. From a clinical point of view, that number had a double edge. On one hand, it reinforced the impression that he was not a deteriorated individual, but fully capable of understanding nuances, consequences, and strategies. On the other hand, it ruled out some easy explanations. It was difficult to argue that such complex decisions as building the Nazi repressive apparatus were the product of a clumsy or confused mind. For Kelly, Göring's high intellectual level made his criminal history even more disturbing, not less. The next step was the projective tests. With the Rorschach plates, the idea was less to measure than to observe how the subject organized ambiguous reality. For each blot, the subject had to say what they saw and explain why. Göring approached the task with a mixture of curiosity and theatricality. He handled each plate carefully, rotated it, commented aloud as if participating in a parlor game. His responses tended to be structured. He did not wander aimlessly or get lost in incoherent associations. He saw human figures, animals, action scenes. He often introduced elements of movement, combat, and strength. There were no hallucinations or breaks with basic perceptual reality. That, for Kelly, was a key piece of data. The test did not reveal psychosis, a private world disconnected from reality, but a mind that used categories of power, struggle, and leadership to organize even neutral images. In parallel, he asked the prisoners to write brief autobiographies. Göring wrote at length and with enthusiasm. In those pages, the psychiatrist found a written version of what he had already heard in the interviews, a narrative centered on himself, on his courage, his rise, and his sacrifices for Germany. Failures were attributed to others, and the harshest decisions were justified as inevitable. This combination of self-justification and pride matched the profile emerging from the other tests. Kelly did not work alone. Gustave Gilbert, a social psychologist and army officer, collaborated closely with him, especially in administering tests and translating when necessary. Both shared protocols and records, but not always the same interpretations. While Kelly tended to focus on cognitive structure and the absence of disorganization, Gilbert emphasized moral aspects and the ideological content of the responses. This difference in emphasis would become more visible over time, but it was already present in this phase of technical evaluation. Viewed as a whole, the information gathered about Göring painted a consistent profile. At no point was there evidence of hallucinations, persecutory delusions, massive memory loss, or severe confusion. There were no signs of dementia or organic brain disorder. Thought was organized, attention sustained, orientation intact. His jokes, irony, and changes in tone were perfectly calculated, not unpredictable outbursts. What did emerge strongly was a trait Kelly noted again and again: extreme egocentrism. In conversations, tests, and writings, Göring placed himself at the center of everything. The fate of Germany, the course of the war, political decisions, even the meaning of the trials seemed in his account to revolve around him. The intelligence test showed capability. The Rorschach, an imagination steeped in power and action. The autobiography, a heroic self-narrative. Together they suggested an authoritarian, narcissistic personality, but far from psychotic collapse. Another point of interest for Kelly was the relationship between personality and addictions. It was known that Göring had arrived at capture with a large reserve of paracodeine tablets and had depended on the drug for years. In Nuremberg, under medical supervision, he lost weight and reduced consumption. The psychiatrist, however, began to suspect that rather than a devastating addiction, what he was seeing was a deeply ingrained habit in a man accustomed to luxury and comfort rituals. The need to control every aspect of his life, including his own forms of pleasure, fit better with the overall profile than that of an out-of-control addict. When comparing Göring's results with those of other defendants, Kelly saw individual variations, but no clinical abyss between them. The high-ranking Nazis were not a group of unmistakable psychotics. They were, for the most part, functional men who could maintain logical conversation, understand their legal situation, and recall their past in detail. Only in isolated cases, such as Robert Ley, did the psychiatrist detect mental deterioration severe enough to justify speaking of genuine mental illness. This finding, cold on paper, struck Kelly on a personal level. He had arrived in Nuremberg hoping to find a psychiatric explanation that would separate these men from the rest of humanity. The tests, however, returned a different image. Individuals highly capable, emotionally shallow, self-centered and power-focused, but without the signs of madness many expected to see. Experimental psychology was not providing the world with a scientific alibi, quite the opposite. As the results came in and Göring's clinical image solidified, Kelly began to sense the conclusion he would be forced to reach. The problem was not an exotic, rare pathology, but a combination of relatively common traits: ambition, egocentrism, and devotion to one's cause, put in service of a criminal political project and protected by a massive power apparatus. The psychological tests, far from reassuring, opened the door to a far more unsettling idea. Under certain circumstances, people with similar profiles could appear in any country and at any time. Charisma as a weapon. Göring's invisible control over those around him. In the Nuremberg prison, the bars, the lights left on all night, and the constant surveillance seemed to reduce the former Nazi leaders to mere cell numbers. But beneath that disciplined surface, the same invisible forces that had structured power in the Third Reich continued to operate. Hierarchies, loyalties, resentments, and above all, charisma. Hermann Göring, even dressed in a prisoner's uniform, remained a specialist in this form of dominance. Douglas Kelly noticed it very early. It was enough to observe the corridor during exercise time or the brief moments when the cells were opened to see that the natural order of the group was not determined by the rules but by Göring's influence. When he spoke, the murmur of the others faded. When he cracked a joke, smiles, sometimes nervous, spread from door to door. Even those who detested him could not help but recognize that he was still silently organizing the atmosphere of the place. Kelly understood that this charisma was not a superficial adornment, but a central component of Göring's psychological structure. It was not just about being likable, it was an almost instinctive ability to take control of any social situation. At the interrogation table, the former Nazi marshal would settle into his chair, look his interlocutor in the eye, gauge their character in a few minutes, and adjust his behavior accordingly. With the American guards, he adopted a friendly, almost military tone, soldier to soldier. With high-ranking officers, he was more solemn, emphasizing his rank and experience. With psychologists, he activated his most intellectual mode, ready to debate ideas and theories. This constant adjustment was not a symptom of instability, but of calculation. Goring knew that everyone who entered his cell could become a mediator to the outside world, a guard who shared anecdotes, a doctor who wrote reports, a chaplain who spoke of his mood. That was why he tried to win them over on different levels. He did not always succeed, but he rarely missed a chance to impress. For Kelly, it was like watching an experienced actor change registers according to the audience, never losing control of the stage. The same pattern appeared in the more formal sessions. When the psychiatrist began a structured interview with questions designed to evaluate memory, judgment, and abstract thought, Goring answered precisely, but also with flourishes. In response to a simple question, he added details, anecdotes, and historical references. He did not simply answer. He turned each response into a small scene. Sometimes he anticipated the next question as if he had guessed the script. Other times he shifted the focus to aspects that suited him, forcing Kelly to redirect the conversation repeatedly. The most unsettling thing for the psychiatrist was how easily that theatricality could be appealing even to critical observers. No matter how much one knew who Goring was and what he was accused of, there were moments when his friendly tone, irony, and apparent sincerity could create a sense of closeness. It was a phenomenon psychologists know well, the ability of certain individuals to build a superficial but effective emotional bond, even when no real empathy exists behind it. Clinically, these were called affable psychopathic traits. In everyday terms, simply someone who charmingly wins people over without one knowing exactly why. Kelly came to define that charisma as a kind of weapon. It did not fire bullets or move armored divisions, but it could disarm rational defenses, dilute the sense of danger, and turn the interview, which should have been an objective analysis, into a kind of conversation between equals. The psychiatrist forced himself to maintain conscious distance. After each session, he recorded not only what Goring had said, but how he had made Kelly feel, what subjective impressions he had provoked. He knew that fascination could turn into a form of blindness. Goring's effect was not limited to professionals. Among the other prisoners, his manner of speaking and behaving fostered a kind of political microcosm. Some revered him as the old comrade who had guided them in the years of triumph. Others blamed him for countless disastrous decisions. Still others sought only his symbolic protection against the uncertainty of the trial. He played with all of that. Sometimes he appeared as the leader, still giving instructions, commenting on defense strategies, offering opinions about lawyers and judges. Other times he adopted the role of the dignified victim, insisting that history would absolve him and condemn his enemies. This combination of roles created a disturbing pattern. It was the same logic he had used on a much larger scale during his time in power: project security, offer certainty, promise protection, and at the same time demand absolute loyalty. In Nuremberg, obviously, his capacity for action was almost null, but his charisma continued to function as a reminder of how it had been possible to mobilize millions of people under a criminal project. For Kelly, observing that magnetism in such a confined environment was like seeing, under a magnifying glass, a mechanism that had once operated on a statewide scale. The psychiatrist also noticed that Goring strove to construct an image of himself for posterity, even within the limited confines of the prison. He knew that psychologists were taking notes, that journalists prowled around the trial, that books would eventually be written about those months. Accordingly, he chose his words carefully, sought grand statements, offered grandiose interpretations of history. He wanted to appear as the defeated but coherent statesman, not as a broken criminal. That impulse to control the narrative was, for Kelly, another manifestation of the same charisma, the attempt to seduce not only those present, but a future audience. The paradox was that the very quality that had helped make him a central figure in the regime made him particularly dangerous from the perspective of the judicial process. A defendant capable of dominating the environment, speaking brilliantly, ridiculing the prosecution, and presenting his actions as rational and necessary decisions could become a focal point of sympathy, or at least ambiguity. It was not that he could convince the judges, since the facts were overwhelming, but that he could sow doubt in public opinion, offering a reasonable version of himself that softened moral rejection. Kelly, who had been called to Nuremberg to assess the mental competence of the defendants, began to understand that his work had another dimension. It was also a counterweight to that charisma. If his reports made clear that Göring fully understood what he had done and why he was being tried, then the personal brilliance of the former marshal could not be used as an exculpatory argument. The character's charm was exposed for what it was, a tool of power, not a sign of moral health. Over time, the psychiatrist reached a conclusion that would shape the rest of his interpretation. Göring's most dangerous quality was not his brutality or fanaticism, but his ability to make all of that seem acceptable, even attractive, to those who allowed themselves to be drawn in by his charm. Charisma, in his case, was not a neutral gift. It was a sophisticated form of symbolic violence. And in the silent corridors of Nuremberg prison, Douglas Kelly watched it operate daily, in miniature, as a disturbing echo of the dominance that man had once exerted over an entire country. 2 psychiatrists, 2 diagnoses, Douglas Kelly versus Gustav Gilbert. In the Nuremberg cell block, there was not just one psychiatrist taking notes, but 2. Douglas Kelly was not the only one who spoke daily with the defendants, observed their gestures and recorded their responses to tests. A few meters away, Gustav Gilbert, a U.S. Army psychologist of Jewish descent, raised in the United States but with perfect German, was working. They looked at the same men, heard similar stories, and applied similar tools. However, from that shared material emerged 2 radically different diagnoses of Hermann Göring and his companions' minds. Gilbert had arrived in Nuremberg with a slightly different assignment. In addition to evaluating the prisoner's mental health, he was to act as a translator and permanent observer of the psychological climate in the prison. He spent long hours in the cells, spoke with the defendants in their language, listened to them vent, argue among themselves, justify their actions, or break down in crisis. Unlike Kelly, who came from medical psychiatry, Gilbert was closer to social psychology. He was interested in how the mind worked in groups, how power and ideology shaped behavior. During the first months, they collaborated closely. They shared offices, reports, quick impressions after interviews. Together, they administered intelligence tests and personality assessments, including the famous Rorschach battery. They would then discuss the results, almost like lab colleagues who had the highest IQ, who seemed more insecure, who showed more emotional coldness. They agreed on one basic point. These men were morally depraved, corrupt, responsible for mass crimes. But when it came to translating that into clinical language, they began to diverge. For Kelly, the central question was clear and relatively narrow. Were the defendants free of psychosis? Did he see in any of them delusions, hallucinations, or thought disorganization that would prevent them from understanding the trial? His criteria were anchored in the classic distinction between severe mental illness and personality. He could admit that there were dangerous traits, that some had deeply narcissistic or cruel characters, but that did not automatically equate to a psychiatric diagnosis that would absolve them of responsibility. Gilbert viewed the same reality from a different perspective. It was not enough for him to say that they were not insane in the technical sense. What he saw, especially in figures like Göring, seemed darker. A combination of superficial charm, lack of empathy, manipulative ability, and a chilling ease in justifying violence. When he later wrote about it, he would speak of aggressive psychopathy, a form of personality in which the absence of moral conscience was not a detail, but the very core of the psychological structure. This contrast became evident in their respective descriptions of Hermann Göring. Kelly defined him, in essence, as a very intelligent man, extremely egocentric, with leadership talent and a remarkable ability to control his emotions when it suited him. He emphasized his clinical normality. He saw no breaks with reality, no mystical delusions, no mental confusion. Gilbert, on the other hand, preferred to emphasize the darker side of the figure. He described him as an affable psychopath, someone capable of being charming and entertaining while at heart lacking real empathy for the suffering of others and willing to do anything to maintain his power. In daily practice, these theoretical differences translated into very concrete conversations. After an especially intense interview with Goring, Kelly might comment that the prisoner had demonstrated once again a clear, logical mind, perfectly capable of understanding the moral framework of his actions, even if he chose to justify them. Gilbert, listening to the same session or reading the transcript, saw in it confirmation of a moral pathology, a subject who rationalized evil with a coldness that, in his eyes, could only be explained by a profound deviation of personality. It was not a simple academic dispute. The two men argued, sometimes sharply, over the meaning of their findings. Gilbert suspected that Kelly was at risk of being seduced by Goring's charisma, of confusing intellectual brilliance with moral normality. In his view, talking about the defendants as ordinary men was downplaying the monstrosity of their acts. Kelly, for his part, feared the opposite, that Gilbert was projecting onto the prisoners the human need to see them as exceptional monsters, separated by an insurmountable chasm from the rest of society. The controversy was especially focused on the interpretation of the Rorschach. The same inkblots that Goring had described in detail became a battlefield. For Kelly, the responses showed a well-structured mind, organized images, absence of perceptual chaos, an emphasis on figures of power and action that fit with his personal history. None of this, he insisted, amounted by itself to a diagnosis of madness or clinical psychopathy in the strictest sense. Gilbert saw something else. In those same associations, he found signs of aggressiveness, dominance, lack of human warmth, sufficient indications, in his view, to speak of a severely deviant personality. Over time, this war of interpretations became almost emblematic. It was not just Kelly and Gilbert arguing. Other psychologists, psychiatrists, and historians later joined the debate over what should be made of those results. Some defended Gilbert's harsher reading. The Nuremberg Nazis would mostly be psychopaths, beings marked by an exceptionally dangerous mental configuration. Others leaned toward Kelly's thesis. The disturbing element was not finding clinical monsters, but discovering the extent to which psychologically functional men could participate in mass crimes if the system offered them power and legitimacy. The difference also had public consequences. Gilbert stayed longer in Nuremberg, followed the final phases of the trial, and soon published his memoirs in diary form, which reached a wide audience. The reading public, still shocked by the recently revealed horrors of the extermination camps, was more receptive to an explanation that spoke of sick personalities, of criminals who seemed to carry a mark of almost biographical evil. Kelly, on the other hand, spoke and wrote about his experience in a colder, more analytical tone, insisting that, except in specific cases, he had not found madmen, but dangerously normal men. His message, harder to digest, had less immediate impact. At the center of this theoretical clash remained the figure of Goring. For Gilbert, his charisma, theatrical sense, and ability to seduce an interlocutor were part of a psychopathic pattern, the friendly mask behind which a moral void hid. For Kelly, those same qualities demonstrated precisely the opposite of madness. They showed an individual who knew the rules of the social game very well, who knew how to read others and exploit them to his advantage. If anything, in his opinion, they proved the need to recognize that evil could present itself with a smile and a logical discourse. A terrifying normality, Douglas Kelly's final verdict. After months of interviews, tests, informal conversations, and daily observation, Douglas Kelly faced the task he had, deep down, been postponing. He had to put his professional verdict in writing. The judges and military authorities did not expect from him a philosophical theory of evil, but something concrete. Were these men, and particularly Hermann Göring, mentally capable of being tried and convicted? By that point, the answer no longer depended on intuition, but on a body of data that Kelly himself had rigorously gathered. What those data showed was, at the same time, clear and unsettling. In Goring, there was no trace of psychosis, no persistent delusions, no imaginary voices, no severe confusion about time, place, or people. His memory was precise, his thinking logical, his ability to concentrate remarkable. When asked about the charges against him, he fully understood their scope. He could describe the structure of the Nazi state, explain his own political decisions, anticipate the legal consequences of what was happening in Nuremberg. In all clinically relevant variables, he was a competent man. In his notes on the Rorschach tests, Kelly used an expression that would over time become famous. He spoke of a basically normal personality. By this, he did not mean that Göring's character was kind or balanced, but that from the perspective of psychic organization, he did not display the fractures associated with madness. The responses to the ink blots were coherent, the associations structured, the perception of reality intact. What stood out was not chaos, but something else, enormous egocentricity and emotional energy directed toward dominance and command. In his later book and lectures, Kelly summarized his finding as follows. The main Nazis at Nuremberg were neither geniuses of evil nor unique historical demons, but men with three fairly familiar traits: a thirst for power, extreme opportunism, and a remarkable lack of moral restraint when the system offered them cover. As a group, they did not have an exotic psychological profile. What distinguished them was the combination of these traits with the historical opportunity to seize control of a modern state. This diagnosis was more uncomfortable than any psychiatric label. If the report had said that Göring was a dangerous psychotic or a severely mentally ill individual, the world might have breathed a certain relief. The Third Reich's crimes would have been explained as the result of an anomaly, a kind of clinical accident. However, Kelly's conclusion went in the opposite direction. What he had seen, he insisted, was the human capacity to take tendencies present in many societies to the extreme. In Göring's specific case, the synthesis was brutal. Here was a man who, facing death, could speak fluently about political strategy, loyalty to the Führer, his pride in the Luftwaffe, and his role in building the regime. He understood the magnitude of the accusations and yet showed no genuine remorse. He could admit tactical errors, recognize military defeats, lament decisions that had backfired, but he rarely at heart questioned the legitimacy of the project he had served. The mental machinery that had justified deportations, murders, and total war remained intact, without psychotic cracks across the psychiatrist's table. Kelly compared that stability with cases in which he had indeed found evident deterioration. Robert Ley, for example, displayed a level of mental disorganization so severe that any observer could recognize it. There, yes, one could speak of illness, but those were exceptions. Most of the defendants, including the former number 2 of the Reich, functioned with a mental clarity that left no room for legal doubt. They knew what they had done, they knew why they had done it, and they were fully capable of answering for it before a court. When he drafted his formal reports, Kelly was careful with his language, but not ambiguous. He noted that Göring was in good physical and mental condition to face the trial, that he understood the nature of the charges, and that he could cooperate with his defense. He insisted that from a psychiatric perspective, there was no basis to declare him unfit to stand trial. He wrote the same about most of the other prisoners. With that decision, he helped ensure that the Nuremberg process proceeded under the premise that the defendants were responsible individuals, not sick puppets. However, in his personal notes and private reflections, the tone was darker. The psychiatrist realized that his conclusions had a paradoxical effect. By demonstrating that the Nazi leaders were not insane, he made clear that nothing prevented people with similar profiles from arising elsewhere, under different symbols and banners. What he had seen in the Nuremberg cells was not a one-of-a-kind monster, but a type of personality that could thrive whenever a society was willing to follow it. That idea, which initially intrigued him as a professional hypothesis, began to haunt him as a moral warning. Kelly tried to formulate that warning positively. He insisted that what had been learned in Nuremberg should be used to strengthen democratic institutions, to be wary of simplistic speeches and leaders offering absolute solutions. But he also knew that his message clashed with a very strong human need, the need to believe that absolute evil can only come from abnormal individuals. By denying that alibi, he became an uncomfortable voice. Many preferred Gustav Gilbert's version, with his diagnoses of aggressive psychopathy, because it fit better with the desire to separate the Nazis from the rest of humanity. Kelly's own life became marked by that tension. In public, he spoke as a scientist, presenting charts, citing tests, explaining the meaning of his findings. In private, he carried the images of the defendants listening to the evidence of the extermination camps, the jokes they made behind closed doors, the ease with which they could move from trivial conversation to a cold description of a massacre. That coexistence between outward normality and inner moral abyss was, for him, the key problem, and also what made it so difficult to convey his message without it sounding like an accusation against the rest of the world. Douglas Kelly's final verdict on Hermann Göring, and by extension on many of his fellow defendants, was summed up in a phrase he repeated in various ways. They were not insane, and precisely for that reason they were so dangerous. The evil they represented could not be contained within a clinical category that kept it at a distance. It was the result of conscious decisions made by individuals who understood what they were doing and justified it within an ideological framework. In Nuremberg, the psychiatrist did not find medical consolation. He found a warning, and that warning, in the years that followed, would become the center of his personal crusade, and the burden he would never manage to leave behind. The trial as a stage, Kelly's influence on how to face Göring. When the sessions of the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg opened, the Palace of Justice building became more than a legal space. It was a stage. In the main hall, cameras, stenographers, diplomats, press correspondents, and military observers intersected. There, not only the fate of 22 men was to be decided, but also the official narrative of how responsibility for war and genocide should be understood. Among all the defendants, one occupied the center of attention: Hermann Göring. Long before he took the stand, prosecutors knew he was no ordinary defendant. He was the former number 2 of the regime, an experienced speaker, accustomed to addressing crowds and asserting himself in political meetings. Psychiatric reports arriving from the prison confirmed this impression. Göring was neither confused, broken, nor on the verge of collapse. He was intellectually brilliant, narcissistic, fully aware of his situation, and determined to make the most of every minute before the judges. In that context, Douglas Kelly's work acquired strategic weight. His evaluations had concluded that Göring and most of the other defendants fully understood the nature of the charges, could follow the proceedings, and cooperated with their lawyers. There was no clinical basis to remove them from the trial. In practice, this meant that the tribunal would face a strong defendant capable of articulating a political discourse and attempting to turn the trial into a platform for his own version of history. If allowed to do so unchecked, he could use the dock as a podium. The Allied prosecutors, led by the American Robert H. Jackson and his British and Soviet colleagues, assumed they were not going to question a sick man, but a seasoned politician. Jackson's opening statement, with his famous line that the war had not simply happened but had been planned and prepared, pointed directly to the idea of conscious responsibility. That framework fit the portrait Kelly had drawn. The defendants were not puppets dragged by incomprehensible forces, but men who had made decisions and implemented them from positions of power. When the moment came for Göring to testify, the entire courtroom seemed to lean toward the stand. In the direct examination conducted by his own lawyer, the former marshal displayed everything Kelly had observed in the cell: confidence, detailed memory, skill in dramatizing. He presented his life as the trajectory of a patriot who had served Germany since World War I. He presented himself as a pragmatic statesman who would have tried to contain the excesses of others if he could have. He relied on the logic of the man of state, a tone in which crimes appear dressed up as necessary decisions. During those first days of testimony, many observers had the uncomfortable sense that Göring was regaining some of his former aura. He responded quickly, corrected the prosecutors when they made errors, insisted on legal technicalities, and recalled dates and names with a fluency that commanded respect, albeit reluctantly. International press began circulating headlines about the rebirth of the old Nazi leader at the stand. The danger Kelly had detected in the prison, Göring's ability to dominate any social space, was materializing now before the entire world. The prosecution's reaction was to adjust its strategy. Facing a defendant who seemed comfortable in rhetoric, the key was to move out of abstraction and return, again and again, to the documents, signed orders, meeting minutes, and the statistics of deportations and executions. The cross-examination in the hands of the prosecutors became a patient task of demolition. Every time Göring tried to envelop himself in grandiose speeches, fragments of the bureaucratic machinery he had helped set in motion were returned to him. In the verbal duel with Jackson, there were moments when the Americans seemed to lose control of the pace, trapped in Göring's long and theatrical responses. But as other prosecutors joined the questioning and the mountain of documents grew, the defendant's shine began to crack. The charisma remained, but it became increasingly difficult to conceal behind it the weight of the evidence. What had manifested before Kelly as lucid egocentrism and manipulative ability in the courtroom turned into a succession of evasions, minimizations, and justifications that began to sound hollow. Douglas Kelly was no longer in Nuremberg when these scenes unfolded. He had been promoted and returned to the United States before Göring took the stand. But he followed the trial through transcripts, news reports, and communications with colleagues. From a distance, he saw confirmed what his prison interviews had taught him. Göring remained the same man he had known, brilliant and narcissistic, incapable of admitting deep moral guilt, convinced that he could at least emerge victorious in the realm of narrative. What was significant for Kelly was not only how Göring behaved, but how the tribunal confronted him. His diagnosis of dangerous normality had reinforced the idea that the defendant should not be treated as a sick man, but as a politician and military officer who had to answer, point by point, for his decisions. By ruling out the insanity alibi, the prosecution focused on showing that Göring's understanding of his actions was as clear as his determination to carry them out. Each time the defendant tried to take refuge in the line of obedience to superior orders, the prosecutors reminded him of his own speeches, his signed instructions, and his declarations of pride in the repression. In that tension between the defendant's performance and the tribunal's response, something deeper than the condemnation of a single man was at stake. What was in dispute was the very idea of individual responsibility under a totalitarian regime. Had Göring been presented as insane, history would have been, in part, reduced to an anomaly. By showing him as a mentally competent, articulate, and calculating man, the tribunal, supported by evaluations like Kelly's, emphasized that the crimes of the Third Reich had been committed by people capable of thinking, understanding, and planning. Toward the end of the trial, when he was allowed to make a final statement, Göring again drew on his repertoire of rhetorical resources. He declared himself a victim of the justice of the victors, attacked the credibility of witnesses, and presented himself as a loyal soldier to his country. But his speech no longer had the same force. The succession of documents, testimonies, and confrontations had eroded it. The courtroom that in the early days seemed to lean toward his figure now looked at him through the prism of accumulated evidence, not charisma. Kelly interpreted that outcome as a kind of practical confirmation of his thesis. The trial had shown to the world's eyes that a clinically normal man could articulate a sophisticated defense, play with words and emotions, and still be exposed as responsible for mass crimes when confronted with the material reality of his actions. The courtroom stage, with its lights, microphones, and stenographers, became for him the natural extension of what he had seen in the cell, the struggle between an individual's seductive narrative and the relentless weight of facts. When the sentence condemned Hermann Göring to death, the legal conclusion was unequivocal. Psychiatry had done its part by declaring the defendant competent. The law did its by establishing guilt. What lingered, however, was the lesson that mattered most to Kelly. The danger does not reside only in uncontrolled fanatics or evident madmen, but also in those who, like his former star patient, know how to use words, charm, and apparent rationality to lead others step by step toward the abyss. The eve of the gallows, Göring's suicide as a final assertion of control. On the night of October 15, 1946, the Nuremberg prison cell block was prepared for a ritual that the Allies had planned with almost surgical precision. The next morning, 12 death row convicts, including Hermann Göring, would be transferred one by one to the gallows erected in the prison gymnasium. Every step, every signature, every witness was arranged to show the world that international justice could be carried out in a cold, controlled, and public manner. Nothing was to be left to chance. For months, the prison commander, Colonel Burton Andrus, had been obsessed with preventing suicides. He had already had to deal with 2 self-inflicted deaths in his custody and knew that a third could ruin his career and, above all, tarnish the image of the trials. That is why the cells were under constant surveillance. The lights remained on, prisoners were frequently searched, and any suspicious object was immediately removed. In theory, it was impossible for anyone to hide something as lethal as a cyanide capsule. In theory. Goring knew this environment well. He had been living under that regime of extreme control for more than a year, watched day and night, subjected to constant inspections. He had lost dozens of kilograms, detoxed from paracodeine, and witnessed other defendants collapse psychologically. He, however, seemed to maintain a kind of unbreakable inner discipline. He knew that his sentence was final. The tribunal had not only found him guilty on all charges, but had also rejected his request to be shot as a soldier. He would die as a common criminal, hanged by a rope, which he considered an intolerable humiliation. In the days leading up to the execution, prison routine was filled with final gestures. The condemned wrote farewell letters, confessed sins to the chaplain, received limited visits from lawyers and officials. Goring was no exception. He wrote messages for his wife Emmy and his daughter Edda, discussed the details of his estate with his lawyer, spoke with the prison's Protestant pastor, Hermann Göring, and even allowed himself a few dark jokes about the approaching death. Nothing in his behavior suggested panic or loss of control. Rather, he projected the image of someone who continued to measure every movement. According to the guards, the night of the execution passed with apparent calm. Goring lay on his bunk, read for a while, and at some point reclined as if trying to sleep. The soldier stationed outside his cell observed him through the peephole, as always. Nothing seemed extraordinary until, late at night, the prisoner's body began to show sudden movements. When the guards broke into the cell, it was already too late. Goring was convulsing in agony with a pungent odor in the air. On the bed, or on the floor, according to different witnesses, appeared the small metal container that had held the cyanide capsule. The scene unleashed chaos. Prison doctors confirmed death a few minutes later. Andrus was informed immediately. The news spread like a sharp shock through the building. The most closely watched prisoner, the highest symbol of the regime judged at Nuremberg, had managed to bypass all controls at the last moment. Journalists, Allied officers, and tribunal officials awoke with the sense that something crucial had been lost. The final spectacle of Goring hanging from the gallows, the image meant to close, almost pedagogically, the cycle of the trial. From that moment on, another story began. The mystery of how he had obtained the poison. Several theories circulated. One of the oldest holds that Goring managed to hide, from the moment of his capture, a cyanide capsule in a cream jar or some personal object that was kept with his belongings and somehow returned to his hands with the help of a trusting guard. Another hypothesis points to the voluntary collaboration of an American soldier whom he may have seduced with his charisma, convincing him to deliver medicine on his final night. Decades later, a former soldier named Herbert Stivers claimed to have passed him a pill hidden in a pen, believing it was a harmless remedy. None of these versions has been confirmed absolutely. What was clear, however, was the result. Goring had achieved exactly what he wanted. He avoided the gallows he considered undignified, thwarted the final act of the Allied justice ritual, and left the prison commander under a shadow that would follow him for the rest of his life. Andrus formally accepted responsibility, and his reputation was permanently damaged. The prisoner's death was not only a challenge to the surveillance system, it was also a symbolic stab at the script that the victors had prepared to close the trial. From afar in the United States, Douglas Kelly received the news with a mixture of surprise and confirmation. He was no longer in Nuremberg, having been transferred months earlier, but he remained obsessed with the man he had studied for so many hours. To many outside observers, the suicide might have seemed a desperate act, the final reaction of someone who could not bear the proximity of death. For Kelly, however, it fit too perfectly with everything he had seen in Goring to reduce it to panic. It was, once again, a matter of control. In his later reflections, the psychiatrist interpreted the suicide as the final move of a man who refused to let others write the end of his story. Goring's entire life, as he told it, was marked by the need to direct the scene, the war hero, the powerful minister, the organizer of terror, the prisoner who still controlled the cell block. In Kelly's eyes, being hanged in front of witnesses, according to the schedule set by the tribunal, would have been complete capitulation to the victor's power. Swallowing a cyanide capsule in his cell, on the other hand, was a way of saying, I still decide. In Kelly's reading, this was not a kind of romantic gesture or military dignity. Göring did not take his life to save others, nor as a moral protest. He did it to assert, until the very last moment, his ability to evade someone else's choreography. He avoided public humiliation, yes, but above all, he avoided becoming the total object of the Allied narrative. Even in death, he ensured he left a puzzle. How had he obtained the poison? Who had helped him? How could a man under constant surveillance defeat the system? Those questions partially shifted the focus from the condemned figure to the failure of those guarding him. For Kelly, that detail was crucial. The suicide did not show a broken man, but someone still thinking in terms of advantage and defeat, scene and audience, script and counterscript. It was consistent with the diagnosis he had developed in the prison: high intelligence, a narcissistic personality, an obsession with legacy, and a radical refusal to accept the position of passive victim. Even in the face of the inevitable, Göring had found a way to present himself as winning the last round, even if only in his own imagination. Over the years, the cyanide capsule that ended the life of the former Reich Marshal became a symbol laden with irony. For the public, it was proof that even the strictest security apparatus can be circumvented by a determined person. For scholars of the criminal mind, it was a chilling reminder. The same drive to dominate, to control, to impose one's own narrative can remain intact up to the very limit of existence. And for Douglas Kelly, that pill was above all confirmation that the man he had examined had not changed in essence. His final act did not contradict the psychological portrait built at Nuremberg. It underscored it. In the early hours of October 16th, while the other condemned were taken to the gallows and their bodies later cremated and dumped into the river, Göring's corpse continued to be the subject of photographs, reports, and speculation. Formal justice had been, in his case, frustrated in form, not in substance. He was dead, but not as planned. The gallows awaited the prisoner who had anticipated the executioner. And somewhere in the United States, the psychiatrist who had tried to unravel that man's mind understood that even in absolute defeat, Hermann Göring had managed to decide how and when to lower the curtain.